On a somber, overcast day, the cemetery stretched out under a heavy sky, with thick, low-hanging clouds that mirrored the weight in Ethan's heart. Kneeling by his father's grave, the young boy's small frame trembled with sobs, his fingers clutching tightly to a worn-out toy dog, a relic of the bond he once shared with his father. Each breath was shallow, as if the grief had hollowed out his chest, leaving him unable to breathe properly. The earthy smell of wet soil mixed with the dampness of the autumn air, and the occasional rustle of dry leaves underfoot was the only sound that dared to disturb the silence. Even the world around seemed to mourn with him. Ethan's whispered pleas broke through his tears. "Take me with you, Dad. Please." His voice cracked, thin and frail in the vastness of the desolate graveyard. He pressed the toy dog harder against his chest, his last tangible connection to his father, wishing somehow that he could cross over to wherever his father had gone. The weight of the loss seemed unbearable, and his young mind struggled to find any reason to keep going in a world without his father. Suddenly, a soft sound interrupted his sobs. He looked up, startled, his tear-streaked face catching a glimpse of movement through the fog that had started to roll in. A dog appeared from between the headstones, padding silently across the damp grass. It was a large, muscular animal, its coat dark and glossy despite the overcast day. The dog stopped a few paces away, watching Ethan with eyes that seemed far too intelligent, too knowing, for just an ordinary animal. There was something almost comforting about its presence, as though it had appeared with a purpose. Ethan blinked through his tears, unsure if the dog was real or just a figment of his grief-stricken imagination. He rubbed his eyes roughly with the back of his hand, expecting the creature to vanish when he looked again. But the dog stayed, still as a statue, watching him with those deep, intent eyes. Feeling a strange pull, Ethan knelt back down, still clutching his toy, but now his focus was drawn to this animal, who seemed out of place in the quiet cemetery. He didn't speak. He wasn't even sure he could find the words. But the dog stepped forward slowly, cautiously, as if sensing the boy's pain. It nudged Ethan gently with its nose, a brief but deliberate touch that felt oddly comforting, almost like a promise. Ethan looked down at the dog in surprise, unsure what to make of the situation, yet somehow finding a tiny shred of comfort in the animal's unexpected arrival. Ethan's gaze shifted back to his father's gravestone, the marble cold and unyielding. "Why did you leave me?" he whispered, barely audible. "I don't know what to do without you." The dog, still close, sat down next to Ethan as if understanding the weight of his words. It stayed there, silent but steadfast, its presence grounding Ethan in a way that words couldn't. The cold wind picked up slightly, causing the trees surrounding the cemetery to sway, their leaves rustling in a melancholic rhythm. Despite the isolation he had felt moments before, the presence of the dog made the world feel just a little less empty. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then reached out, his hand trembling as it hovered just above the dog's head. The dog, patient and calm, waited, its intelligent eyes never leaving Ethan's. When Ethan finally touched its fur, he felt a strange connection, something deep and almost indescribable. He didn't know what it meant, but for the first time, in what felt like forever, his heart didn't feel quite as heavy. The dog shifted slightly, leaning into Ethan's touch, and for a brief moment, it felt like his father was watching over him, like this dog had appeared for a reason beyond simple coincidence. Ethan couldn't explain it, but as he sat there with the dog by his side, a quiet sense of peace began to settle over him. Yet, as much as this moment soothed the sharp edges of his grief, Ethan was left with a question burning at the back of his mind. Why had this dog come to him? Was it really just a stray, or was there something more to its sudden appearance? He glanced back at the grave, then at the dog, the uncertainty gnawing at him. The dog nudged him again, this time more firmly, as if urging him to stand. Ethan rose slowly, wiping his eyes on his sleeve, feeling the cool air brush against his tear-streaked face. The cemetery seemed quieter now, almost serene. But the connection between him and the dog felt strangely purposeful, as if this was only the beginning of something neither of them fully understood yet. As the dog continued to watch him, Ethan couldn't help but wonder. Did his father send this dog to him? The thought was absurd, wasn't it? Or was it? He turned toward the path leading out of a cemetery, the dog following at his side, leaving the question hanging in the air like the mist that still clung to the ground. As Ethan and the dog walked away from a cemetery, the weight of the morning still lingered, though the presence of the dog, now a constant by his side, gave him an odd sense of comfort. He wasn't sure why, but with each step, the grief didn't press quite as hard against his chest. The toy dog still dangled loosely from his hand, a reminder of the bond he once shared with his father, and now, in some strange way, with the real dog beside him. Ethan's mind began to drift, his thoughts taking him back to days when his father was still alive. His father had always loved animals, especially dogs. He used to tell Ethan stories of their loyalty, bravery, and ability to understand things that humans couldn't. They had always planned to get a dog of their own, but time had slipped away before they could. Now, standing at the edge of the cemetery with the stray at his side, Ethan wondered if somehow his father had been right about animals knowing more than they let on. The dog nudged his leg, pulling him back to the present. He glanced down and met its eyes. There was something familiar in the way it looked at him. The dog seemed almost to be asking if he was all right. Ethan swallowed hard, feeling the weight of those intelligent eyes. "You should have a name," Ethan said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't keep calling you dog forever." He thought for a moment, looking at the sleek, dark coat and the way the animal seemed to follow him without hesitation, like a shadow. "How about Shadow?" The dog blinked slowly, as if in agreement, and Ethan felt the faintest flicker of a smile tug at his lips. It had been so long since he had smiled, even a little. When they arrived home, the sun was just beginning to break through the clouds, casting a muted light over the small house. Ethan's mother, Sarah, stood at the kitchen window, her face pale and drawn as she spotted her son approaching with the dog by his side. She hurried to the door, wiping her hands nervously on a dish towel. "Ethan," she called as he came closer. "What's this? Where did you find that dog?" Her voice was laced with concern, but there was something softer underneath, the kind of worry that came from a deep place of love. She hadn't been the same since her husband's death either, and now, seeing Ethan with this dog, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. "He followed me," Ethan said simply, as if that explained everything. He knelt down to pat Shadow's head, the dog staying close to him, sitting protectively by his side. "I named him Shadow." Sarah hesitated, her eyes lingering on the dog. The way it stayed so close to Ethan, its protective stance, and the quiet comfort it seemed to give him, it reminded her too much of the man they had lost. She took a slow breath, unsure whether having the dog around was a good idea, but she could see the change in her son's face. There was a spark in his eyes that she hadn't seen in weeks, maybe months. "I don't know, Ethan," she began, her voice shaky. "Are you sure we should keep him? A stray. We don't even know where he came from." Ethan looked up at her, his voice firm but quiet. "He's not just a stray. He's different. He understands things, Mom." He paused, glancing at Shadow, then back at his mother. "Please, just for a little while." Sarah looked at them both, the boy she loved more than anything, and the dog that now stood so loyally by his side. She couldn't bring herself to say no, not when the dog seemed to be helping in ways she couldn't. "All right," she relented softly. "But just for a while, okay?" Ethan nodded, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. He turned to Shadow, giving him a quick pat on the head. "You hear that, boy? You're staying." Over the next few days, Ethan's connection to Shadow grew in ways he hadn't anticipated. The dog seemed to understand his every move, his every thought. At night, Shadow would sit by Ethan's bed, keeping watch while the boy slept fitfully, waking often with dreams of his father. And during the day, the dog never left his side, as if sensing that Ethan still carried the weight of his grief, even though he didn't always show it. One afternoon, while out for a walk, something strange happened. They were nearing the corner of their street when Shadow suddenly tensed, his ears perked up, and he stepped in front of Ethan, blocking his path. Ethan frowned, confused, but before he could react, a car came screeching around the corner, speeding by far too fast. It was gone in a flash, but if Shadow hadn't stopped him, Ethan would have stepped right into its path. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he knelt down beside Shadow, his fingers shaking as they tangled in the dog's fur. "How did you know?" he whispered, the question hanging in the air as Shadow stared at him, calm and steady, as if this was just another part of his job, keeping Ethan safe. That night, as Ethan lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the question lingered in his mind. Shadow wasn't just any dog. His behavior, the way he seemed to know things, reminded Ethan of the stories his father used to tell him about heroic animals, about how some dogs could sense things before they happened, how they would protect their humans at all costs. Was Shadow one of those dogs? Or was it something else? He didn't know. But one thing was certain. Shadow was here for a reason, and Ethan felt it deep in his bones. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to this dog than he had first thought. As the night stretched on, Ethan found himself wondering if Shadow's appearance had been a coincidence at all, or if, somehow, his father had sent him exactly what he needed. As the days passed, the connection between Ethan and Shadow only grew stronger. Shadow never left his side, as if he had made it his mission to watch over the boy. Ethan, in turn, felt an increasing sense of peace whenever Shadow was near. It was almost as if his father's presence lingered in the dog, though Ethan couldn't explain it. Still, a quiet suspicion grew in his mind, one he couldn't shake no matter how hard he tried. One evening, after another long day at school, Ethan sat on the floor of his room, flipping through an old photo album. The pages were worn, the edges curling from years of use. As he turned the pages, memories of his father filled his mind. His father's laugh, his warm smile, and the way he used to tell Ethan stories before bed, especially about animals and their unbreakable loyalty. Dogs, in particular, had fascinated his father. They had always talked about getting a dog, but had never found the time. Shadow lay beside him, his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but ever watchful. As Ethan continued flipping through the album, something caught his eye. He turned back a page, staring at a faded photograph that made his breath catch in his throat. In the picture, his father stood smiling, with a dog by his side, a dog that looked eerily similar to Shadow. Ethan's heart raced as he studied the picture more closely. The dog wasn't an exact match, but the resemblance was uncanny. Same dark, glossy coat, same powerful build, even the same intelligent eyes that seemed to look straight through you. It was too much to be just a coincidence, wasn't it? "Is that you?" Ethan whispered, glancing at Shadow. The dog lifted his head, tilting it slightly, as if trying to understand what Ethan was saying. The connection felt even stronger now, like there was something linking this dog to his father in a way that Ethan didn't fully understand. Unable to shake the feeling, Ethan did some research. He remembered his father being involved with a local dog rescue organization, and so he spent the next few days searching online and asking around. He found old articles and records about the organization, which focused on helping stray dogs find homes. There were even a few legends passed down among the volunteers, stories of dogs acting as guides for grieving people or appearing just when someone needed them most. One story stood out. It spoke of dogs who, after forming deep bonds with their owners, somehow returned to guide their loved ones after death. Ethan's mind raced as he read through the article, the pieces slowly starting to come together. Could Shadow be connected to his father in ways beyond just appearance? Had his father's love for animals brought this dog into Ethan's life? The thought was both comforting and unnerving. Ethan didn't believe in supernatural things, but he also couldn't deny the strange events that had started to happen since Shadow arrived. He didn't know what to believe anymore. But one thing was clear. Shadow was no ordinary dog. The way he had appeared in Ethan's life, at just the right moment, the way he seemed to know things before they happened, it was all too much to ignore. Meanwhile, Sarah, Ethan's mother, had been observing the changes in her son. At first, she had been skeptical of Shadow, worried that the dog would be a constant reminder of her late husband. But she couldn't help but notice the way Shadow behaved around Ethan. There was something more than loyalty in the dog's eyes, something she couldn't quite place. It was almost as if Shadow understood Ethan's grief and responded to it in ways no human could. One evening, Sarah stood at the window, watching Ethan and Shadow playing in the yard. She recalled how her husband had always believed in the loyalty of dogs, often joking that if they ever got one, it would probably take better care of Ethan than they could. As she watched them now, that old joke seemed to carry a strange weight. Shadow wasn't just any dog. He was a calming presence, and despite her initial reservations, Sarah began to accept that Shadow might be exactly what they needed. But Shadow's role would soon become even more profound. One chilly evening, as the last light of dusk faded into night, Ethan went for a walk to clear his mind. The cold autumn air nipped at his cheeks, and his breath hung in misty clouds as he and Shadow made their way to the cemetery. The familiar path led them to his father's grave, where they often sat in silence. Shadow suddenly stopped, his nose twitching, ears alert. Ethan frowned, watching as the dog began to paw at a spot near his father's grave. Shadow wasn't one to dig or act out, so Ethan knelt down beside him, curious. The dog kept digging, his paws moving quickly now, as if he knew something was hidden beneath the surface. Ethan brushed away some of the dirt with his hands, his fingers growing cold from the damp earth. As he dug deeper, he felt something solid beneath his hands. His heart began to race. He pushed away the remaining dirt and uncovered a small wooden box, old and weathered but intact. His hands trembled as he lifted it from the ground. Shadow sat close, watching intently, his dark eyes never leaving the box. Slowly, Ethan opened it, revealing a stack of letters inside, each one addressed to him. The sight of his father's handwriting, slightly smudged with age, sent a fresh wave of emotion through him. He unfolded the first letter, his breath catching as he began to read his father's words. The paper smelled faintly of old wood and time, and the words were like a whisper from the past. His father spoke of love, of hope, and of the things Ethan needed to hear. It was as if his father had known exactly what Ethan would need in this moment. Shadow had led him to this. Tears streamed down Ethan's face as he sat by his father's grave, reading the letter that felt like a bridge between the living and the dead. For the first time since his father's death, he didn't feel so lost. His father's words, carried across time, had found their way to him, and Shadow had been the one to lead him to this truth. He hugged Shadow tightly, his voice a whisper through the tears. "Thank you." Shadow remained still, his warm presence steady in the cold night air, as if his job had always been to protect Ethan, not just from the world, but from the depths of his own grief. Ethan didn't fully understand how or why, but he knew one thing for certain: Shadow had been sent to him for a reason. As the days grew colder, the bond between Ethan and Shadow continued to deepen, and the letters from his father became a source of strength. Every night, Ethan read through each letter slowly, savoring his father's words and feeling as though a part of him had been brought back. Shadow, ever by his side, seemed to sense the importance of these moments, always lying close, his presence a constant comfort. But even with this new sense of peace, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Shadow's role in his life wasn't finished yet. The dog had already protected him once, had led him to the letters that brought him a kind of closure he hadn't thought possible. What more could Shadow be here for? One late afternoon, as the sun began to sink beneath the horizon and the sky turned a pale shade of gold, Ethan decided to take Shadow for a long walk through the woods at the edge of town. It was a path they'd taken many times before, winding through tall trees whose bare branches clawed at the sky, their fallen leaves crunching underfoot. There was a stillness in the air, the kind of quiet that comes before something big happens, though Ethan didn't yet realize it. The deeper they ventured into the woods, the more Ethan noticed Shadow's behavior changing. The dog was alert, his body tense as he scanned the area ahead. Something was off. Ethan felt it too, a prickling sense of unease that crawled up his spine. "Shadow, what is it, boy?" Ethan asked, but Shadow didn't respond in his usual calm way. Instead, he moved ahead of Ethan, standing between him and the path, as if to block his way. Ethan tried to move around him, but Shadow barked, a sharp, warning sound that Ethan had never heard from him before. Suddenly, a low rumble echoed through the woods, and the ground trembled beneath Ethan's feet. He staggered, confused and alarmed. Before he could react, the sound grew louder, and in an instant, the peaceful woods erupted into chaos. A rock slide. It crashed down the hillside above them, triggered by some unseen force. Stones and debris rained down, the air filled with the deafening roar of rocks splitting and trees cracking under the force. The path ahead was a blur of destruction. Ethan froze. His heart pounded, his breath hitched in his throat. "Run, move." His mind screamed, but his legs wouldn't obey. Shadow acted first. He lunged forward, pushing Ethan backward with a strength that knocked him off his feet. Ethan hit the ground hard, gasping as a large boulder crashed into the spot where he'd stood moments before. Shadow barked again, more urgently, tugging at the sleeve of Ethan's jacket. Ethan scrambled to his feet, his hands stinging from the fall, but he barely noticed the pain. He didn't have time to think. Just follow. Shadow yanked at his sleeve again, and Ethan stumbled forward, racing through the trees as the world collapsed behind them. The sound of falling rocks and snapping branches filled the air. Ethan's lungs burned as he ran, dodging debris, his legs aching with every step. The ground was uneven, treacherous, but Shadow led the way, darting between trees, guiding him through the danger with an instinct Ethan couldn't explain. Everything became a blur of panic and movement. Branches whipped against Ethan's face. The cold air stung his skin, and every breath felt like fire. But Shadow never faltered, never slowed. He kept pushing Ethan forward, his body always between Ethan and the danger, until finally, mercifully, the ground leveled out and the roaring behind them faded. They emerged from the trees, stumbling onto the flat stretch of land at the forest's edge. Ethan collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, his entire body trembling from the adrenaline. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Shadow stood beside him, panting heavily but unharmed. For a long moment, Ethan could do nothing but breathe, his chest heaving as he tried to steady himself. He pressed his palms into the cool earth, grounding himself. Slowly, the panic ebbed away, replaced by a heavy realization. If Shadow hadn't acted, Ethan wouldn't have made it. He wouldn't be here. Ethan lifted his head, staring at the dog. Shadow looked back at him, his dark eyes calm and steady, as though this had been no extraordinary feat, just another moment of doing what needed to be done. But Ethan knew better. Shadow wasn't just a protector. He was more than that. Tears welled up in Ethan's eyes as he reached out, pulling Shadow close. He buried his face in the dog's fur, his body shaking, not from fear, but from the overwhelming flood of emotion. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick. Shadow stayed close, his warmth soothing the chill that clung to the evening air. Ethan's mind raced with everything that had happened. The way Shadow had appeared in his life just when he needed him, how the dog had saved him more than once, led him to the letters, and now saved him again. There was no denying it anymore. Shadow wasn't just any dog. "You're here because of him, aren't you?" Ethan whispered, glancing up at the sky, the pale light of dusk beginning to fade into night. "You're here because he sent you?" The words felt right. They made sense, even if Ethan couldn't explain it fully. Shadow wasn't his father, but somehow his father's love had found a way to reach him through this dog. It wasn't magic. It wasn't supernatural. It was something simpler, something truer. Love. That's what it was. The love his father had always shown him, now living on in Shadow, guiding him, protecting him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, Ethan felt a peace he hadn't known for a long time. His father was gone, but he wasn't lost. His love was still here, in every moment, in every breath, in every step Shadow took beside him. A few days later, Ethan found himself back at the cemetery, sitting quietly by his father's grave. Shadow lay next to him, his head resting on Ethan's lap as the boy ran his fingers through the dog's fur. The cool stone of the gravestone was smooth under his hand, its cold surface grounding him in the present. The autumn chill was biting, but Ethan didn't feel cold, not with Shadow by his side. He stared at the gravestone, reading the words etched into the stone for what felt like the 100th time. "Did you send him to me, Dad?" he asked softly, though he wasn't expecting an answer. His heart already knew the truth. Shadow stirred, his dark eyes lifting to meet Ethan's. The dog's calm presence felt like the answer itself. Ethan smiled through his tears, feeling a deep sense of connection to his father, even though he wasn't physically there. His father's love had guided him, through Shadow, through the letters, and through the quiet strength that still lingered in his heart. "Thank you," Ethan whispered to the wind, the words carrying out into the quiet cemetery. Shadow leaned into him, and Ethan closed his eyes, allowing himself to feel the warmth of that love one more time. No matter what, he knew he would never be alone again.